Greetings and salutations, comrades. Hope this finds you well. Quick shout out to the two Uber comrades supporting this channel, my content on Patreon, my partner. Thank you. And Independent Left News. Definitely check out Independent Left News. They are a great resource. So tonight, I'm going to be chatting about this amazing book. Highly recommend reading it, getting a copy for yourself. If you haven't, if somebody wants to borrow this, shoot me a DM on Twitter or shoot me an email. I'd be happy to loan you it. It's only about 45-ish pages long, pretty easy to digest, and I feel like it's just as relevant to the conditions that we face today as it was back in the day when Marx and Engels wrote this many years ago. So I'm just gonna read it and add some commentary when I think it's warranted. So well, should I read the preface? Okay, let's just read the preface. Preface is by Engels. The Manifesto was published as the platform of the Communist League, a working men's association, first exclusive German, later on international, and under the political conditions of the continent before 1848, unavoidably a secret society. So again, written quite a long time ago, but from my perspective, a lot of what is in here is very much still relevant, today to the material conditions that we face and the, horrors of, capitalist system and late stage capitalism, I think is, what we're in the United States, right? So this is page 8 where it kind of starts by Karl Marx. Manifesto of the Communist Party by Marx and Engels. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals, and German police spies. Where's the party in opposition that has not been decried as communistic by its opponents in power? Where the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties, as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things will result from this fact. One, communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. Two, it is high time that communists should openly, in the face of the whole world, publish their views. 100%. If you identify as a communist, say it loud and proud. Just like Boots Riley. I remember he was being interviewed by Amy Goodman of Democracy Now, and she I think described his political views as being anti-capitalist, and Boots Riley quickly corrected her and said, "No, I'm a communist. I think it's important. It's okay to be against capitalism, but what are you actually for? I'm a communist, so I say that, and I'm very happy to label myself as such, right?" Their aims, their tendencies, and meet the nursery tale of the specter of communism with the manifesto of the party itself, which is exactly what this is, right? To this end, communists of various nationalities have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto to be published in the English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages. Chapter 1, Bourgeoisie and Proletarians. Hit that like button. Helps with the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel. If you're not, it helps out. The history of all hitherto, that's a great word, hitherto, existing society is the history of class struggle. Again, the only reason governments come into place is because of these irreconcilable class antagonisms, and communism would be a classless and stateless society because the state would simply wither away, right? Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed. And obviously what we have in the United States is, the class antagonism between the working class and the capitalists, and, the corporate duopoly, the Democrats and Republicans, completely beholden to these, capitalist interests. stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common room of the contending classes. In the earliest epochs of history, find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs, and almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradations. And obviously definitely applies to, the United States right now in the class society that we live in, right? The modern bourgeoisie society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. If anything, particularly the context that I'm most familiar with in the United States, these class antagonisms are, coming more and more to the forefront, where we have, again, a very, very small capitalist class at the top who has immense wealth and power. Their material conditions are just, obscene, while we have, poverty amidst plenty, right? That's a direct byproduct of this capitalist system. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified the class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat, or the capitalist class and the working class. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang chattered burghers of the earliest towns. From these burgesses, the first elements of the bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opened. On to page 10 now. Gotta stay hydrated. Got some spring water here. Fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie. The East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with colonies, the increase in the means of exchange and the commodities generally gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, and impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary elements in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, in which industrial production was monopolized by closed guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the capitalists, of the wants of the new markets. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed aside by the manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of the division of labor in each single workshop. Meantime, and markets were kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant modern industry, the place of the industrial middle class by industrial millionaires, the leaders of the whole industrial armies, the more modern bourgeoisie. Modern industry has established the world market for which the discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has in turn reacted on the extension of industry, and in proportion to industry, commerce, navigation, railways extend in the same proportion. The bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie itself, the product of a long course of development, how a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange, each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by a corresponding political advance of that class, 100%. An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, it became an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune. Here, independent urban republic, as in Italy and Germany, their taxable third estate, page 11, of the monarchy, as in France, afterwards in the period of manufacture proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a counterpoise against the nobility, and in fact, cornerstone of the great monarchies in general, the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry end of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. And I think that definitely speaks, to the United States, how the bourgeoisie, the, capitalist class has the exclusive political sway, as Marx and Engels talk about here. I mean, just look at, all of the policies that are passed by the, Democrats and Republicans, almost, without exception, disproportionately benefit the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, while the, working class, the material conditions of the working class continue to deteriorate, at very, alarming levels, especially for the most, vulnerable and marginalized elements of the working class. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for I really love this. This 100% accurate, I think, in describing the United States, but I think other, developed capitalist societies. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. Boom, mic drop. The bourgeoisie has played a most revolutionary role in history. The bourgeoisie, wherever it's gotten the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations, has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left no other bond between man and man than naked self-interest, the callous cash payment. And I think that's definitely very true of, capitalism. We're just, taught and indoctrinated to look out for our own self-interest. Everybody else, be damned. If it's, good for me, if it advances my interest, then, fuck all these externalities, right? It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, and the icy water of egotistical calculation. Wow. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation veiled by religious and political illusions, is substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. And again, capitalism is an inherently exploitive system, because working class, their labor, surplus labor value, is taken by the capitalist class. And that's, again, inherent to capitalism. It's a form of exploitation. The bourgeoisie is stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. And again, that's, something that's unique to capitalism is wage labor. And that's how the capitalist class is able to, accumulate their wealth by, exploiting the workforce, the working class, through wage labor, right? The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil, has reduced the family relations to a mere money relation. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionaries so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted, on to page 12 now, expedition that put in the shade all former migrations of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. I think Marx and Engels are completely correct here. Capital is a, revolutionary force. It's able to shapeshift in order to continue to, increase profits. And, that's what they're talking about here, revolutionizing the instruments of production, right? Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeoisie epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is hollow is profaned. And man, at last, compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. Kind of reminds me what, Lenin was talking about, how imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. I think this is kind of what Marx and Engels are getting at here, right? It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character of production and consumption in every country. To the great chagrin of reactionaries, has drawn from under the feet of industry the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up indigenous raw material, but raw material drawn from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home but in every quarter of the globe. And we definitely see that with like the food that's available at grocery stores, right? At least in the United States. In place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants requiring for the satisfaction of products of distant lands and climes. In place of the old and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations. Page 13. And as in material, so also in intellectual production, the intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from numerous national and local literatures, there arises a world literature. The bourgeoisie, by rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all nations, even the most barbarian, into civilization. The cheap prices of its commodities are the heavy artillery which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeoisie mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst, i.e. to become bourgeoisie themselves. In a word, it creates a world after its own image. I agree. I think it's hard to argue with what they're saying there. The bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns, has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Just as it has made the country dependent on the town, so has made barbarian and semi-barbarian countries dependent. I don't necessarily agree with those phrasing, barbarian and semi-barbarian, but on the civilized ones, or civilized nations of peasants and nations of bourgeoisie, the East on the West, more and more the bourgeoisie keeps doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property as amalgamated population, centralized means of production is concentrated property in the hands of a few. Again, very much what's happening in the United States. For example, during the pandemic, we have, the billionaire class, a handful of capitalists at the top who have increased their wealth by, hundreds of billions of dollars, basically, while, the masses are greatly suffering. There was, tens of millions of people out of work. We couldn't get, universal health care during a pandemic, while, very small elite were able to enrich themselves drastically, and we couldn't even get $15 minimum wage. And again, that's not even a livable wage, right? Let's see. The necessary consequences was political centralization. Independent or loosely connected provinces with separate interests, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one national class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive, more colossal productive forces than, onto page 14 now. Hopefully I'll be able to get through another 20 pages or so, because the second chapter, which starts on page 22, is really, really good. Probably my favorite one. Page 14. Have all preceding generations together, subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry, agriculture, steam, navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground, what earlier centuries had been a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered into the lap of social labor. We see then that the means of production and of exchange, which served as the foundation for the growth of bourgeoisie, were generated in feudal society. At a certain stage in the development of these means of production and exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged, feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry, in a word, the feudal relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. Again, it's talking about how this capitalist mode of production is a revolutionary force, right? They had to burst asunder. They were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted to it and by the economic and political sway of the bourgeoisie class, which again, that class almost has exclusive sway over the, political instruments, the government in the United States, and I think to a lesser extent in other capitalist countries, but still plays a large role, right? Similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeoisie society, with its relations of production, of exchange of property, the society has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld from which he is called up by his spells. That reminds me of that Fantasia, that Disney movie where I think it was Mickey Mouse. He's like the sorcerer's apprentice, and he takes the wand and conjures up this scale or this spell, and all kind of hell breaks loose after. That's kind of what that reminds me of. For many a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the property relations that are the conditions for the existence of bourgeoisie and its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crises that by their periodical return put the existence of the entire bourgeoisie society on trial, each time more threateningly. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that in all early epochs would have seemed an absurd. I really love this. Yeah, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine and universal war of devastation had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there's too much civilization, too much means of substance, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further development and the conditions of the bourgeoisie property. On the contrary, they become too powerful for these conditions by which they are fettered. And no sooner do they overcome these fetters than they bring disorder into the whole of the bourgeoisie society, endanger the existence of bourgeoisie property. The conditions of bourgeoisie society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeoisie get over this crisis? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, on the other, by the conquest of new markets. Again, that's why, capitalist mode of production is a system based on infinite growth on a finite planet. It's kind of problematic, and we're seeing that, in real time with the, ecological disaster that, that capitalism creates, i.e., climate change, right? That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive, more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. So they talk about this later, but basically, the capitalist class, capitalism itself, creates the conditions for its eventual, collapse and overthrow. But not only has the bourgeoisie forged the weapon that bring death to itself, has also called in existence the men who are to wield these weapons. I was talking about the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion as the bourgeoisie, i.e. capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat. The modern working class developed a class of laborers who live only as long as they can find work, and who find work only so long as the labor increases capital. These laborers, who must sell themselves piecemeal, are a commodity like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes, say that 5 times fast, of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division, hey Mabel Jones, how's it going? On to page 16 now. Labor, the work of the proletarians, has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the working man. You kind of getting into, how capitalism is inherently an alienating system. Then it alienates us from our labor. It alienates us from our fellow worker in the workplace. It alienates us from the natural world. Obviously, all hugely destructive things in their own way, right? Let's see. The work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine and is only the most simple, most monotonous, most easily acquired knack that is required for him. Hence, the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of subsistence that he requires for his maintenance and for the propagation of his race. This makes me think about all the strikes that are going on in the United States right now, whether it be the workers at John Deere who just voted to go on strike, the miners in Alabama at Warrior Met Coal who have been on strike, I think since March or April, the Nabisco workers who are recently on strike, the Kellogg's workers who are on strike now, the healthcare workers who are on strike, and they're, basically saying F off to the capitalist class. We're tired of this, meager subsistence that you're providing to us. And that's what, employers, the capitalist class, tries to do, try to maximize profit as much as possible. And how do you do that? You try to pay the workers a subsistence level, basically just enough to keep them alive, keep them coming back again. And obviously, applies to, benefits, pensions, healthcare, etc., right? But the price of a commodity, and therefore also labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as the repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same as the use of machinery and in the same proportion, the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by increase of the work exacted in a given time, or by increased speed of machinery. Again, that's something that a lot of these different industries where people on strike right now, they're having to work sometimes 12, 16-hour days. The Kellogg's workers were having to work sometimes up to 120 days straight with no time off. Similar conditions, to those coal miners, etc. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates in the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeoisie class and the bourgeoisie state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker. Makes me think of, Amazon, right? They're basically tracking the workers' movements in these warehouses, like step by step, minute by minute, second by second. And above all, by the individual bourgeoisie manufacturer himself. The more, like Bezos, right? The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, the more embittering it is. I think we see that across, industry in the United States, just these deplorable conditions that the working class, is subjected to, especially the most vulnerable and marginalized elements among it, right? The less the skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry develops, the more is the labor of men suppressed by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use according to their age and sex. No sooner has the laborer received his wages in cash, for the moment escaping exploitation by the manufacturer, than he is set upon by the other portions of the bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker. Again, landlords are not part of the working class. Sorry to burst that bubble, just like cops. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, page 17 now. Shopkeepers, retired tradesmen, generally in the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale in which modern industry is carried on, and is kind of talking about the monopolistic qualities of capitalism, and how like libertarian folks will say, well, that's actually not true capitalism, like free markets and competition, when capitalism always develop these monopoly practices, because that's what enables them to increase their profit motive. And that's what capitalism is all about, is making as much profit as possible. And to do that, you need to monopolize. Let's see. With modern industries carried on and swamped by the competition with large capitalists, partly because their specialized skills are rendered worthless by new means of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. Proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie, and that struggle is very much, evident in the United States and all these other capitalist countries across the world. At first, the contest is carried on by individual laborers, then by the work people of a factory, then by the operatives of one trade and one locality against individual bourgeoisie who directly exploits them. So, for example, the different workers in these different sectors that are on strike right now, right? They direct their attacks not against the bourgeoisie conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash machinery to pieces. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the banished status of the workmen of the Middle Ages. Definitely not, opposed to those tactics that Marx was doing there, if push comes to shove, right? At this stage, the laborers still form an incoherent mass scattered over the whole country, broken up by their mutual competition. I think that's, fairly true for the United States. We need to build, solidarity across industries, across sectors, and be able to institute things like wildcat strikes or striking in, solidarity with other industries. I think we could really, achieve some great benefits for, the material conditions of the working class here, right? If anywhere they unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequences of their own active union, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which class, in order to attain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion, and is moreover still able to do so for a time. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies, the remnants of absolute monarchy, the landowners, the non-industrial bourgeoisie, the petty bourgeoisie. Thus, the whole historical movement is concentrated in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeoisie. But with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in numbers, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows and it feels the strength more. And I think, a lot of working class people are starting to feel that strength in the United States. For example, we have all these different industries going on strike. And then we had in August, saw this article from Reuters. It was the largest number of people quitting from their jobs in quite, I think, going back to like 1986 or something like that. Let's see. The various interests and conditions of life within the ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized in proportion as machinery obliterates all. Page 18 now. All distinction of labor, and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same level. We see that in the United States, the wages have been basically stagnating or on a downward trend since probably late 70s, early 80s. I mean, I don't think the federal minimum wage has been increased. Was it under Obama or Bush? The growing competition among the bourgeoisie and the resulting commercial crises make the wages of the worker ever more fluctuating. That precarious nature of, capitalism, and obviously that benefits the bourgeoisie because you're able to drive down, wages if everybody's competing for these jobs. So that's why capitalism creates this army of the unemployed because it benefits them, right? If you're able to maximize more profits when you have workers fighting over these, really shitty paid and compensated jobs. The unceasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. And again, that's the real mindfuck of capitalism, right? In the United States, particularly, we have all these high levels of technological development, but that hasn't really, eased the burden of the working class at all. If anything, it's made it more, precarious, as Marx was talking about, right? Like technology hasn't led to people being able to work less but still get paid the same. If anything, it's led to more, exploitation and surveillance of the working class. The collision between individual workmen and individual bourgeoisie takes more of the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers begin to form combinations, trade unions. Against the bourgeoisie, they clubbed together in order to keep the rates of wages up. They found permanent associations in order to make provisions beforehand for the occasional revolts. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots. It kind of reminds me of the strikes that are going on right now, the forming of those trade unions. Now and then the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battles lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of workers. This union is furthered by the improved means of communication, which are created by modern industry, which take place. Workers of different localities in contact with one another. And I think that's particularly true right now in the age, of the internet, social media, email, cell phones, etc. I mean, that's just how forward thinking their analysis was then. It still very much applies in a lot of ways to now. And again, this was written, I think, 1848, it said in the preface. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize numerous local struggles, all the same character, into the national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle. 100%. Look how the capitalist class has, bought and paid for the the political structures of the United States, and they're always ready and willing to do their bidding, unfortunately. And that union to attain which the burghers of the Middle Ages and their miserable highways required centuries, the modern proletarians, thanks to railways, achieve in a few years. The organization of the proletarians into a class and consequently into a political party is continually being upset again by the competition between workers themselves. But it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. It compels legislative recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. Thus, the 10-hour bill in England was carried. And again, we have the 8-hour workday thanks to unions in the United States. Altogether, which unfortunately doesn't apply to every job, but you get the idea. Altogether, collisions between the classes of the old society further the course of development of the proletariat in many ways. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those proportions of the bourgeoisie itself, whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry, at all times with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries. Page 19. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal. Like the stream, subscribe, it helps. In all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for its help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own elements of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with the weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. So again, that's capitalist system. Capitalists give the working class, the proletariats, the necessary conditions to actually work towards the abolishment of capitalism and installing a dictatorship for the proletariat. Further, as we already seen, the entire section of the ruling classes are, by the advance of industry, into the proletariat, or at least threatened in their conditions of existence. They also support, I already read that. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears the decisive hour, the process of disillusion going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of the ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, and thus that holds the future in its hands. So, kind of seems to me, let's see, Bill Bradley said, in the US, we've fallen into an ugly pattern of young progressives being corrupted by the system. The progressives of the progressive era in the 1980s, 1890s became the establishment. Yeah, I think that's, definitely true and very accurate, and very much is what is happening right now, in the United States with so-called, progressives in Congress who aren't really willing to speak truth to power or call out, Democratic leadership or Joe Biden, and they're really just ready and willing to go along to get along, to either they just don't want to have that type of, antagonistic behavior to actually get these, policies that would help the, working class disproportionately, or they're just not capable or not willing because it would, impact their career interests. I mean, for God's sakes, I saw Ilhan Omar was doing an interview. I forget the outlet, but you could find it on Twitter. One of her political role models was Margaret Thatcher. I mean, and wasn't AOC was saying that, I think, yeah, she gave this glowing, eulogy or praise for John McCain when he died. But again, I think that's really the limits of, these Democrats, these social democrats, these liberals. They're completely fine with the capitalist system. They just want, capitalism with a human face, or the Nordic model, even though there's, huge amount of exploitation, under, so-called, Nordic model, style of, this highly developed welfare state. But yeah, I mean, I was listening to a talk early today on the Black Power Media channel. Shout out to BPM. They do great work about the child welfare system and how, people might want to go into that system thinking they can change it. But if you're any type of threat to these systems, whether it be, in the political realm or the child welfare realm or educational realm, if you're actually a threat to the establishment, they're not going to let you get a foot in the door. That's why, Obama, was able to become, president, because he wasn't a threat to the status quo in any way, right? But yeah, completely agree. Bill Bradley, point well taken. There we go. Let's see. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class, 100%. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary, but conservative. Nay, more, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they're revolutionary, they are so only in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present, but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to adopt that of the proletariat. On to page 20. The dangerous class, the social scum, the lumpen proletariat, which I'd heard that term before, but I didn't know exactly what that meant. So the social scum, the dangerous class, the lumpen proletariat, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of old society may here and there be swept into the movement by our proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. It's pretty interesting. I'm going to have to do some more background on what they're actually talking about with the lumpen proletariat. If you have any insight or analysis, let me know down below. The social conditions of the old society no longer exist for the proletariat. Got two more pages, and then the next chapter is Proletariats and Communists, probably my favorite chapter, so excited to get into that. The social conditions of the old society no longer exist for the proletariat. The proletarian is without property. His relations to his wife and children is no longer anything in common with the bourgeoisie family relations. Modern industrial labor, modern subjection to capital, the same in England as in France, in America as in Germany, has stripped him of every trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeoisie prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeoisie interests. All the preceding classes that got the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation. The proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure, and to fortify their mission is to destroy all previous securities and insurances of individual property. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement, yes, this is an important part. The proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lower stratum of our present society, cannot raise itself up without the whole superincumbent strata of the official society being sprung into its air. Though not in substance, yet in form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all, settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we trace more or less veiled civil war raging within existing society up to the point where war breaks out into open revolution, page 21, where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. Hitherto, it's a great word too, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressing and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to under which it can at least continue its slavish existence. The serf in the period of serfdom raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeoisie under the yoke of feudal absolutism managed to develop into a bourgeoisie. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the progress of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. Definitely very much true, in the United States. He becomes a pauper, and pauperism develops more rapidly in the population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in the society and to impose its conditions of existence upon a society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to ensure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink in such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. And I think we're increasingly getting closer and closer to that point in the United States from my perspective. The essential condition for the existence and sway of the bourgeoisie class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The conditions for capital is wage labor, as we were talking about earlier. Oh, hello, KRTD Media, which I will be going on their channel for an interview. I think it was on the 29th afternoon, right? Looking forward to that. Let's see. Where did we leave off? The development, wage labor rests exclusively on competition between laborers. The advance of industry, whose involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of laborers due to competition by the revolutionary combination, due to association. Development of modern industry therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces above all are its own grave diggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. So ending this chapter on a little bit of a pause note, so I'm just going to read that again. The development of modern industry therefore cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeoisie produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, are its own grave diggers. Again, bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, capitalism creates the conditions for its eventual downfall. And I think that is something I think more and more people are, really wanting to see at this point, because they've lived and experienced the horrors of living in a capitalist society where, again, profit is put before the needs of the people, before the needs of the natural world. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Hallelujah. Chapter 2, Proletariats and Communists. Page 22. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletariats as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which they shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the working class parties by this only. In the national struggle of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. 2. In the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. The communists, therefore, are, on the one hand, practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, the section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have, over the great mass of the proletariat, the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of communism is the same as that of all the other proletariat parties. For formation of the proletariat into a class, the dictatorship of the proletariat, overthrow of the bourgeoisie supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. So again, a dictatorship of the proletariat would mean that the masses of workers would, be dictating, the conditions, a rationally, centrally planned economy designed to meet the needs of the many, as opposed to the capitalist system that we have now, which is only designed to meet the needs of a very few, the capitalist class at the top. Let's see. Which do you think will happen faster? Is workers uniting or right-wing populist uprisings on their own? Hedges has been warning us that if we can't get it together, revolution will come from the right. Yeah, I mean, really appreciate Hedges, insight and an analysis on a lot of things. But I also think that, I don't know, he also is very, I feel like, pessimistic in some ways, or maybe he's just, I don't know, a realist. But I mean, I want to say I hope it's the workers uniting, because right wing populists, I mean, that's just basically I don't know, that would be very, very bad, especially for all the people who are against fascism and all the ills that come with that. And we see these various reactionary elements on the right in the United States, whether it be the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, or these other fascistic groups are out there spreading hate and white supremacy and anti-immigrant rhetoric and etc. So, and then their anger is obviously very much displaced, or I mean placed on in a completely opposite direction of where it actually should be placed. And I think that's just a way of the ruling class to take the class analysis out of it, and you direct it at things that aren't actually the cause of people's problems, which is what Trump did. It's the the immigrants are the problem. It's these people coming in from these quote unquote shithole countries, etc. When it's actually no, it's like the capitalist class is fucking over everybody. It's not the people coming from these really horrible conditions, largely due to U.S. imperialism. It also needs to be pointed out. So I really hope it's the former and not the latter there, Bill. But it's so hopefully that's the case. Hedges watched the system crush his friend Nader. Yeah, I mean, Ralph Nader would have been a really amazing president. I think he actually would have really, spoke truth to power and tried to enact, different policies that would have, helped out the working class. Because he was really big, like, I think getting like seatbelts into cars and different like car safety stuff. He's always been like a consumer advocate. I think he ran as a Green Party candidate, right? And Hedges was a speechwriter during 2000, something like that. And I always like how Hedges talks about how, Bernie Sanders is a sheepdog for the Democratic Party. I don't know, that always brings a smile to my face. Yeah, misplaced anger for sure. Misplaced, misdirected, and that's kind of what the capitalist class, wants. They don't want the working class to, unite, because if we're able to do that on any type of substantive, scale, then we'd really be able to, bring the capitalist class to the bargaining table, if you will. Let's see. The communists, therefore, I already read that part. Page 22. I'm going to probably read maybe. Try to get through another 10 pages, but it's definitely it takes a lot longer reading it out loud than it does in my head. So I might have to do a part 2, but I do think, this is really important book. Page 23, the theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on the ideas and principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express in general terms actual relations springing from an existing class struggle. Again, like as Lenin talked about, it's a Marxist-Leninist thought outlook, is a concrete analysis of the concrete conditions, not looking at things in the past and then, applying that outlook to the present, or not looking at how you want things to be in the future. Actually, what is going on right now on the ground, and using that, as your analysis, as kind of your standpoint, right? The abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. All property relations in the past have continually been subject to historical change, consequent upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeoisie property. This distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeoisie property. That's important. But the abolition of bourgeoisie property. But modern bourgeoisie private property is the final, most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonism, on the exploitation of many by the few. And that is, you want to sum up capitalism in a couple of words. It's the exploitation of the many by the few. Well said, Marx and Engels. In this sense, the theory of communists may be summed up in the single sentence of abolition of private property. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. So again, they're not talking about getting rid of all property. They're talking about getting rid of bourgeoisie property that's, was acquired through exploitation, through exploitating practices of capitalism, of the working class. Let's see. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeoisie form? There is no need to abolish that. Development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. Yes, 100%. I mean, you see all these big, box stores, chain stores, the Amazons, the Walmarts of the world, where these little quote unquote mom and pop shops are, disappearing at a rapid rate. To what extent they even, exist at this point, right? Or do you mean modern bourgeoisie private property? Yes, they obviously do. But does wage labor create any property for the laborers? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e., that kind of property which exploits wage labor and which cannot increase except upon the conditions of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. Always, they're analyzing the contradictions that are, taking place in capitalist society. To be a capitalist is to have not only a purely personal but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society can it be set in motion. Capital is therefore not a personal, it is a social power. This is page 24. When therefore capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. Let us now take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, i.e.
I'm sorry if he's boring, y'all.
Sometimes he talks a
She's
lot.
the boring one.
Hey, no, I'm not.
Yes, she is.
You are.
I.e. that quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely required to keep the labor in a bare existence as labor. Again, that's what all employers, businesses try to do, pay the workers the least amount as possible in order to maximize their profits, right? What therefore the wage labor appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation, under which the labor lives merely to increase capital and is allowed to live only so far as the interests of the ruling class require it. Law, yes, law bill. In bourgeoisie society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulated labor. In communist society, accumulated labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of labor. Doesn't that sound like a much better system? Under a communist society, person's labor is a means to widen, enrich, to promote the existence of the working class, as opposed to under a capitalist system, working class's labor is used to increase the wealth of the capitalist class. Again, that exploitation is inherent to capitalism, right? In bourgeoisie society, therefore, the past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeoisie society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent, has no individuality, 100%. In the abolition of the state of things is called by the bourgeoisie abolition of individuality and freedom, and rightly so. The abolition of bourgeoisie individuality, bourgeoisie independence, and the bourgeoisie freedom is undoubtedly aimed at. By freedom, page 25, by freedom is meant under the present bourgeoisie conditions of production, free trade, free selling, and free buying. But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about free selling and buying and all the other brave words of our bourgeoisie about freedom in general have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with the restricted selling and buying with the fettered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no meaning when opposed to the communist abolition of buying and selling of the bourgeoisie conditions of production and the bourgeoisie itself. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property, but in your existing society, private property is already done away with 100%. For 9/10 of the population, existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. Again, very small capitalist elite bourgeoisie class at the top owns and controls a vast majority of society. All these different resources are in the hands of a very small few, while the masses struggle. The poverty amidst plenty that capitalism generates, right? Generates extreme wealth for a very few, and everybody else is fighting for crumbs, if that, unfortunately. But Richard Wolff said that the system is the sickness. Let's see. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existent property for the immense majority of society. I know it's just so interesting when people try to prop up capitalism and talk about how great it is. Like, bro, people, you're actually not a capitalist. Do you own any capital? Reminds me of that meme. Oh shit, what is that? That Forrest Gump, that Tom Hanks movie. It's like I forgot which. They're on the fishing or shrimping boat, and it's like I think it's Captain Dan. He says, I support capitalism, or I'm a capitalist," and then Forrest Gump's like, "You don't have any capital, Dan," or something like that. You've probably seen it around. It's a good one. Um, in a word, from the moment when labor can no longer be converted into capital, money, or rent into social power capable of being monopolized, i.e. from the moment when individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeoisie property, into capital, from that moment you say individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by individual I mean no other person than the bourgeoisie, than the middle class owners of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive, there's a very important distinction, all that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriation. Again, be getting rid of exploitation in that sense. Kind of important, I think. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease and universal laziness will overtake us. Again, like communism doesn't mean there wouldn't be labor, there wouldn't be work. You just wouldn't be getting exploited through that work, through that labor. According to this, bourgeoisie society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through their sheer idleness. For those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The capitalist class, right? The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology. There can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. Because that's how capital generates their wealth, is through exploiting working class through their wage labor, surplus, surplus labor value, surplus theory of labor value, right? All objections urged against the communist mode of producing and appropriating material products have in the same way been urged against the communist modes of producing and appropriate intellectual products. Just as to the bourgeoisie, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself. So the disappearance of class culture is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. The culture, the loss which he laments, is for the enormous majority a mere training to act as a machine. 100%. We're all treated as, working class is treated as, cogs in this capitalist, machine. One of us dies, well, then somebody else, get in there and, become that sprocket on the wheel. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeoisie property the standard of your bourgeoisie notions of freedom, culture, law, etc. Your very ideas are the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeoisie production and bourgeoisie property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into law for all. 100%. Like the laws we have in the United States are designed and written and executed for the benefit of the working class, right? A will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economic conditions of the existence of your class. A selfish misconception that induces you to transform into internal laws of nature and of reason, and the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production. This misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly in this case of ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are of course forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeoisie form of property. Abolition of the family, even the most radical flare-up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On what foundation this present family, the bourgeoisie family, based? On capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie. But this state of things finds its complement in the practical absence of the family among the proletariats and in public prostitution. Page 27. The bourgeoisie family will vanish as a matter of course when a complement vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime, we plead guilty. Guilty as charged. But you will say we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replaced home and education by social. And your education. It's not that also social and determined by the social conditions under which you educate by the intervention of society, direct or indirect, by means of school, etc. The communists have not invented the intervention of society and education. They do but seek to alter the character of the intervention and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. Again, ruling class, ideas, ways of looking and viewing at the world, definitely very much, embedded in K through 12 education in the United States, and I would say at the university level as well. And I would, argue that's probably very true for, a lot of other capitalist societies, abroad, right? Let's see. The bourgeoisie claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parent and child becomes all the more disgusting, the more by the action of modern industry. All family ties among the proletariats are torn asunder and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. But you communists would introduce community of women, screams the whole bourgeoisie in the chorus. The bourgeoisie sees in his wife a mere instrument of production. He hears the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to know the conclusion that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women. The Powell memo lays out how the ruling class wanted to influence all society, including education. Powell became a Scottish justice. Yes, that what is that first name? But yeah, I know what you're talking about there, Bill Bradley. That's a really cool. I like your avatar there. Let's see. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. Kind of important, right? That's something we should all want. For the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of our bourgeoisie at the community of women, which they pretend is to be openly and officially established by the communists. The communists have no need to introduce community of women, as existed almost from time immemorial. Our bourgeoisie, not content with having the wives and daughters of their proletariats at their disposal, not to speak of the common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Oh, cool. Okay. Yeah, I got 3.5 more pages, then I'll end it. But this is, again, definitely highly recommend reading this on your own time. Happy that you're listening to me ramble on about this great work that's still so relevant, even though this was written like 172 years ago by Marx and Engels. Bourgeoisie marriage is in reality a system of wives in common, and thus at the most what the communists might possibly be reproached with is that they desire to introduce in substitution for a hypocritically concealed and openly legalized community of women. For the rest, it is self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of community of women, springing from that system, i.e. prostitution, both public and private, or, sex work, to use the, present-day vernacular, right? The communists have further reproached with the desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working man have no country. Again, that's why, from my perspective, it's very problematic for so-called socialist or communists, in the United States to be, claiming that the U.S. flag is some, symbol of freedom or some symbol of good. Look at the actual fucking material conditions, what that flag means to so many people within the imperial core here in the United States, and particularly people, abroad. I don't know, people in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Iran, Syria, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, etc., etc. A lot of people see the American flag, rightly to them, it's a symbol of, genocide, white supremacy, sanctions, wars, occupations, rape, murder, torture, etc., right? Stolen land, right? Genocide. Let's see. We cannot take from them what they have not got, since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to the leading class of the nation, must constitute itself the nation. It is so far itself national, though not in the bourgeoisie sense of the word. National differences and antagonisms between people are vanishing gradually from day to day, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and in the condition of life correspond thereto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still further, faster. United action of leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions of the emancipation of the proletariat, which they're a little bit off base here because we saw, the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the USSR. Russia, at that time, the material conditions there were very, backwards compared to a lot of other places, particularly in Europe, and yet they were able to have this successful socialist, revolution. So they were a little bit, off on that, but we'll cut them a little slack because these Engels and Marx made a huge, contribution, right? Let's see. In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another is put into an end, the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put to an end. The proportion as the antagonisms between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. And again, currently, living in the United States is the biggest purveyor of death and destruction in the world. Always needs to be, pointed out. It's also a highly developed, capitalist society. And as Lenin talked about, as I mentioned before, imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, right? And the U.S. is always trying to overthrow and destabilize any independent, any left-leaning, any socialist country, and that has unfortunately remained unchanged. Not surprisingly to me, unfortunately, under the Biden administration. I just saw a thing that Anthony Blinken said that they're not going to lift any sanctions on Syria. They're still sanctioning the fuck out of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, North Korea, Iran, etc. It's disgusting, right? The charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving a serious examination. Does it require deep intuition to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conceptions in one world, man's consciousness change with every change in the conditions of his material existence and the social relations? And yes, 100%. Like our social conditions, the material world, impact our outlook and how we see things. 100%. I definitely agree with Marx and Engels on that. What else does the history of ideas prove? That intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed. The ruling ideas of each age have been the ideas of the ruling class. Blinken and Austin, are you talking about Lloyd Austin? I'm assuming the Secretary of Defense, right? Create a lobbying firm before taking the position to create a direct line to themselves for the MIC. Pine Island Capital Partners. I don't put it past that type of shit. That revolving door between big business, military industrial complex, and the U.S. government. I think before taking that job as Secretary of Defense, Austin was one of the higher ups at Raytheon. He was like on their board of directors, something, right? Bill Bradley. Let's see, page 29, and we got 2.5 pages left. At least for this chapter. I'm going to call it good after that. What else does the history of ideas prove? I already did that. Yeah. When people speak of ideas that revolutionize society, they do but express the fact with the old society, the elements of a new one have been created, and the disillusion in the old ideas keeps even pace with the disillusion in the old conditions of existence. When the ancient world was in its last throes, the ancient religious were overcome by Christianity. When Christian ideas succumbed in 18th century to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the then revolutionary bourgeoisie. The ideas of religious liberty and freedom of conscience merely gave expression to the sway of free competition within the domain of knowledge. Yeah. Undoubtedly, it will be said, religion, moral, philosophical, and juridical ideas have been modified in the course of historical development. But religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survived this change. Quote, there are besides eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common to all states of society, but communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality instead of constituting them to a new basis. It is therefore acts in contradiction to all past and current experiences. What does this accusation reduce itself? So, the history of all past society is constituted in the development of class antagonisms that assume different forms at different epochs. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to past ages vis-a-vis the exploitation of one part of society by the other. We definitely very much have that in the United States. Again, the capitalist class exploits the working class. No wonder then that the social consciousness of the past ages, despite all multiplicity and variety in its displays, moves with certain common forms or general ideas which cannot be completely vanished except with the total disappearance of class antagonism, which is what communism means, a classless and stateless society. Because a classless society, you no longer need the state because the state comes into play because of these class antagonism, right? And so that is what, the lower phase of communism, socialism, would be the dictatorship of the proletariat. The highest phase would be, communism, a classless and stateless society. The communist revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional property relations. No wonder that its development involves the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. Page 30. Page and a half left. But let us have done with the bourgeoisie objections to communism. We have seen above that the first step in the revolution by the working class, here we go, is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to establish democracy, a dictatorship of the proletariat. So we have, the masses who we would have a rationally and centrally planned economy designed to meet the needs of the masses, as opposed to what we have now in a capitalist system, a system designed to only benefit and enrich, a very small minority of people, right? The capitalist class. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degrees all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as a ruling class, dictatorship of the proletariat, as I keep mentioning, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeoisie production, by means of measures, therefore, which appear economically insufficient, untenable, but which, in the course of the movement, outstrip themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. One more drink. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. 100% what might work, let's say, in the United States might not work as well in Canada, might not work as well in Mexico, might not work as well in Colombia, might not work, et cetera, right? Nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. 1. Abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. 3. Abolition of all right of inheritance. 4. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with the state capital and exclusive monopoly. 6. Centralization of means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. I definitely agree with that. Extension. 7. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of soil generally in accordance with the common plan. Kind of important to have healthy soil, 100%. Like, not going to be able to feed people if we continue to degrade the soil in the United States, keep spraying and using massive amounts of pesticides and herbicides. Soil health, soil biology, kind of important, right? And yeah. Let's see. 8. Equal obligation of all to work. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equal distribution of the population over the country. 10. Free education for all children in public schools, abolition of child factory labor, in its present form, combination of education with industrial production. I would probably, add some, other areas to this, but again, this probably made a lot of sense to Marx and Engels when they were writing this in the, 1840s, 1850s. When in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared, and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power loses its political character. It's again that's the withering away of the state, that realization of a true communist society. Political power, properly so called, is merely organized power of one class for oppressing another, 100%. If the proletariat during its contest with the bourgeoisie is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if by means of a revolution it makes itself the ruling class, again a dictatorship of the proletariat, and as such sweeps away by force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonism, yes, and of classes generally, and thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In place of the old bourgeoisie society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And now I think that is something that we can all hold on to and try to work towards in our own, different ways, in our own different capacities, right? So that was the end of chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto. So we got through the first 2 chapters. There is, I think, 1 or 2 more, but I'm going to end it here. Thanks for hanging out and listening to me read this book and ramble on about how amazing it is. All power to the people. Like the stream if you haven't. Subscribe for more content. Peace, much love. Hope this finds you well.